I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who would sit in her car outside a bank, holding a slip of paper with my own son's loan information, my hands trembling with a mixture of rage and determination. But there I was, parked under the cedar, trees that gave our small Oregon town its name, staring at the account number that would change everything between us forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Just 48 hours earlier, I'd been Linda Hayes, devoted mother of 2, wife of 38 years, the woman who always showed up with casseroles during illness and remembered everyone's birthdays. I was the grandmother who babysat without complaint, the mother-in-law who bit her tongue to keep the peace. I was the woman who believed that family came first, always, no matter what it cost me personally. Now I was someone else entirely, someone who had finally reached her breaking point. The morning that changed everything started like any other Thursday in Cedar Falls. November rain drummed against my kitchen windows as I prepared my famous apple cinnamon muffins, the ones that had been a family tradition for over 2 decades. The scent of cinnamon and nutmeg filled my ranch-style home on Elmwood Drive, and I found myself humming as I worked, anticipating the joy these treats would bring to my son Marcus and his wife Brianna. It was their 3rd wedding anniversary, and I'd planned to surprise them with breakfast at their farmhouse on Oak Ridge Road. Frank, my husband, had already left for his job at the lumber mill, grumbling about the weather, but kissing my cheek goodbye as he had every morning for nearly 4 decades. His coffee cup sat in the sink, still warm to the touch, a small reminder of the comfortable routine that had defined our lives together. I packed the muffins carefully in my favorite wicker basket, the one my own mother had given me when I'd first married Frank. The basket had seen countless family gatherings, school bake sales, and neighborly gestures of kindness. It was worn smooth from years of use, but sturdy and reliable, much like I'd always prided myself on being. The drive to Marcus and Brianna's place took me through the heart of Cedar Falls, past the familiar landmarks that had anchored my life for so long. The old courthouse with its weathered brick facade, the diner where Frank and I had our first date, the bookstore where I'd worked part-time for the past 5 years, helping customers find their next great read while earning a small income that gave me a sense of independence I'd never quite articulated to myself. Marcus and Brianna's farmhouse sat on 3 acres of land that had once belonged to Brianna's grandmother. It was a beautiful property, with a wraparound porch and mature oak trees that provided shade in summer and a stunning display of color each fall. Marcus had spent months renovating the place before their wedding, his contractor's skills evident in every carefully restored detail. I'd been so proud watching him transform that old house into a home, the same way I'd watched him grow from a skinny boy who collected rocks to the successful man he'd become. As I pulled into their gravel driveway, I noticed Brianna's sleek white SUV parked beside Marcus's work truck. The sight of it always gave me a small pang of something I couldn't quite name. The vehicle was immaculate, detailed weekly at the car wash downtown, financed through a loan that I knew stretched their budget thin. Brianna had insisted on the luxury model, complete with heated leather seats and a navigation system that could probably guide you to the moon. Marcus had mentioned the monthly payments once, wincing slightly as he did, but I'd learned not to comment on such things. Young couples had their own way of managing money, Frank always reminded me, even when that way seemed questionable to those of us who'd lived through leaner times. I knocked on their front door, balancing the basket of muffins against my hip. Through the window, I could see movement in the kitchen, and my heart lifted with anticipation. There was something special about sharing food with the people you loved, about creating those moments of connection over something made with your own hands. It was a love language I'd spoken fluently for decades, one that had always been received with gratitude and warmth. Marcus opened the door, and I immediately noticed something was different. His smile seemed forced, his usual easy greeting replaced by an awkward pause. He was dressed for work already, his tool belt hanging from his shoulder, keys dangling from his hand as if he'd been about to leave. "Mom," he said, the word carrying a strange weight. "What are you doing here?" The question caught me off guard. In all the years since he'd moved out, I'd never needed an invitation to visit my own son. "I brought anniversary muffins," I said, lifting the basket slightly. "Thought you and Brianna might enjoy them with your morning coffee." Before Marcus could respond, Brianna appeared behind him, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light from the hallway. She was dressed in her real estate agent attire, a tailored blazer and pencil skirt that spoke of success and ambition. Everything about her was polished, from her manicured nails to her carefully applied makeup. She'd always been beautiful, but there was something about her perfection that made me acutely aware of my own worn jeans and comfortable sweater. My graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. "Linda," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was less than pleased about something. "We weren't expecting you." "I wanted to surprise you both," I replied, maintaining my smile despite the growing awkwardness of the situation. "It's your anniversary, after all." Brianna exchanged a look with Marcus, one of those silent communications that married couples develop over time. I'd seen Frank and I do the same thing countless times, but somehow when Brianna and Marcus did it, it felt exclusionary rather than intimate. "We're actually running late," Brianna said, checking the expensive watch on her wrist. "I have a showing at 9, and Marcus needs to get to the Henderson job site." I felt the first stirring of disappointment but pushed it aside. "Of course I understand. Maybe I could just leave these for you to enjoy later." "That would be great, Mom," Marcus said, reaching for the basket. But Brianna's hand touched his arm, stopping him. "Actually," she said, her tone carefully measured, "we're trying to cut back on sweets. For health reasons, you understand." The words hit me like a physical blow. These weren't just any sweets. These were my muffins, made with love and tradition, crafted from a recipe that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in my family. They were anniversary muffins, made specifically to celebrate a milestone in my son's life. "Oh," I managed, my voice sounding small even to my own ears. "I didn't realize." "It's nothing personal," Brianna continued, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "We're just being more mindful about our diet. I'm sure you understand." I stood there for a moment, clutching the basket that suddenly felt incredibly heavy. The rain continued to fall around us, creating a soundtrack to my humiliation. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his eyes not quite meeting mine, and I realized, with crystalline clarity, that he wasn't going to speak up for me. He wasn't going to acknowledge the effort I'd made, the tradition I'd tried to honor, or the love that had motivated me to drive across town in the rain. "Of course," I said finally, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I should have called first." "Next time," Brianna said, already stepping back inside. "We really do need to get going." And just like that, the door closed. Not slammed, nothing dramatic, just a quiet, decisive closing that left me standing on the porch with my rejected muffins and my wounded pride. I could hear their voices inside, muffled but urgent, and I knew they were discussing me, discussing how to handle the inconvenience of my unexpected visit. I walked back to my car slowly, the basket feeling heavier with each step. The rain had intensified, soaking through my sweater and making my hair stick to my face. I placed the muffins carefully on the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel, not trusting myself to drive just yet. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to fury. This wasn't the first time Brianna had dismissed me, I realized. It wasn't even the second or third. Over the past 3 years, there had been a steady accumulation of small slights, subtle put-downs, and casual dismissals that I'd chosen to overlook in the interest of family harmony. The wedding planning where my suggestions had been politely ignored. The holiday gatherings where my contributions had been relegated to paper plates and plastic cups, while Brianna's friends used the good china. The countless times I'd offered help only to be told they had everything under control. But those muffins, sitting there in their wicker basket, represented something more than just breakfast. They represented decades of love, of showing up, of putting my family's needs before my own. They represented the woman I'd been trying so hard to be, the mother-in-law who never complained, who always supported, who would do anything to maintain the peace. And they had been rejected without a second thought. I started the car and drove home through the rain, my mind churning with emotions I couldn't quite name. When I pulled into my driveway, Frank's coffee cup was still in the sink, a reminder of the normal morning I'd expected to have. The kitchen still smelled of cinnamon and love, but now it felt like a mockery of my efforts. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the basket of muffins, and allowed myself to really examine what had just happened. Brianna's words echoed in my mind. "We weren't expecting you." As if I were an intruder rather than family, as if my presence in their lives was something to be managed rather than welcomed. The phone rang, interrupting my spiral of thoughts. It was my daughter Nicole calling from her home in Portland. "Hey, Mom." Her voice was warm and familiar. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said automatically, then paused. Was I fine? "Actually, I'm having a bit of a morning." "What happened?" I told her about the muffins, about Brianna's rejection, about the awkward exchange on the porch. As I spoke, I could hear the anger creeping into my voice. The hurt I'd been trying to suppress finally finding its way to the surface. Nicole was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "Mom, you know this isn't the first time she's done something like this, right?" "What do you mean?" "Brianna. She's always been territorial about Marcus. Remember last Christmas when she rearranged all the presents under the tree because she didn't like how you'd organized them? Or when she insisted on redoing the table settings for Easter dinner because yours weren't sophisticated enough?" I did remember, but I'd dismissed those incidents as Brianna wanting things to be perfect. Now, hearing Nicole list them out, they took on a different significance. "I think she sees you as competition," Nicole continued, "for Marcus's attention, for his loyalty, and she's been systematically trying to diminish your role in his life." The words hit me like a revelation. "But I'm his mother." "Exactly, and she can't change that, so she's trying to make it irrelevant." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about what Nicole had said. I thought about all the times I'd excused Brianna's behavior, all the times I'd bitten my tongue to keep the peace. I thought about Marcus, my firstborn, the little boy who used to climb into my lap when he was scared, who brought me dandelions from the yard and called them flowers for the most beautiful mom in the world. When had he stopped standing up for me? When had he started allowing his wife to treat me as an afterthought? The rain continued to fall outside, and I found myself thinking about the bank slip in my purse, the one with their car loan information, that Marcus had given me months ago in case of emergency. They'd been having some financial difficulties, and he'd asked if I could help with a payment if things got tight. I'd agreed immediately, grateful to be needed to be useful. But now, sitting in my kitchen with a basket of rejected muffins, I began to wonder if being useful was the only value I had left to my son. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If my role in his life had been reduced to nothing more than a financial safety net and a convenient babysitter, the anger that had been building since the porch encounter began to crystallize into something harder, something more determined. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for First National Bank of Cedar Falls. Patricia Walsh, the loan officer I'd spoken with before, answered on the third ring. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, recognizing my voice. "How can I help you today?" "I need to discuss the car loan I'm co-signed on," I said. my voice steadier than I'd expected. The one for my son and daughter-in-law. There was a pause. Of course. Are you calling to make a payment? No, I said, the word coming out more firmly than I'd intended. I'm calling to remove myself as a co-signer. And that was the moment everything changed. Not with dramatic music or lightning bolts, but with the quiet determination of a woman who had finally reached her limit. I made an appointment for that afternoon, hung up the phone, and sat back in my chair, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Power. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was taking action rather than simply reacting. I was making a choice based on my own needs rather than everyone else's comfort. It was terrifying and exhilarating and long overdue. The muffins still sat in their basket, cooling and rejected, but they no longer represented failure to me. They represented the last time I would allow myself to be dismissed, the last time I would swallow my pride to keep someone else's peace. I had spent 38 years being the woman everyone else needed me to be. Maybe it was time to figure out who I actually was. That afternoon, I sat in Patricia Walsh's office at First National Bank, signing papers that felt like a declaration of independence. The loan documents were spread across her mahogany desk, each signature representing a severing of financial ties that had bound me to Marcus and Brianna's choices for the past 2 years. Are you certain about this, Mrs. Hayes? Patricia asked, her voice gentle but professional. She was a woman about my age, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and graying hair styled in a neat bob. Removing yourself as a co-signer will mean they'll need to qualify for the loan on their own income alone. Given their current debt-to-income ratio, that could be challenging. I paused, my pen hovering over the final signature line. A part of me, the part that had spent decades prioritizing my children's needs above my own, wanted to reconsider. But then I remembered the weight of that rejected basket in my hands, the casual dismissal in Brianna's voice, the way Marcus had stood, silent while his wife treated me like an inconvenience. I'm certain, I said, signing my name with a flourish that surprised us both. Walking out of the bank, I felt a strange lightness in my chest. The November air was crisp and clean after the morning's rain, and Cedar Falls looked different somehow, as if I were seeing it through new eyes. The familiar storefronts and tree-lined streets that had been the backdrop of my life suddenly seemed full of possibilities I'd never noticed before. My phone rang as I reached my car. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and my stomach tightened. Word traveled fast in a small town, especially when it involved financial matters. Mom, what the hell did you do? His voice was strained, angry in a way I rarely heard from him. I removed myself from your car loan, I replied calmly, settling into the driver's seat but not starting the engine. I assume Patricia called? You. She had to. We got a letter saying we have 30 days to requalify or they'll demand full payment. His voice cracked slightly. Mom, we can't afford the full payment right now. The Henderson job got delayed, and Brianna's commission from last month fell through. For a moment, the old Linda wanted to apologize, to rush to the bank and reverse what I'd done. But the new Linda, the one who had been born in the humiliation of that morning, held firm. I'm sorry to hear about your financial difficulties, I said, meaning it genuinely while maintaining my resolve. But they're not my responsibility anymore. Not your responsibility? Marcus's voice rose. Mom, I'm your son. We're family. Are we? The question came out sharper than I'd intended, years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. Because this morning, when I came to your house to celebrate your anniversary with homemade muffins, your wife treated me like a stranger. And you let her. Silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we'd never said to each other. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice quieter now. She was just having a stressful morning. You know how she gets before big showings. No, Marcus. I gripped the phone tighter. This wasn't about one stressful morning. This was about 3 years of your wife systematically diminishing my place in your life, and you allowing it to happen. That's not fair, isn't it? When was the last time you called me just to talk? When was the last time you visited without needing something? When was the last time you stood up for me when Brianna decided I wasn't good enough, smart enough, or sophisticated enough? The silence that followed was answer enough. I love you, Marcus, I continued, tears threatening but my voice remaining steady. I will always love you. But I won't continue to be treated as a convenience, only valued when you need financial help or babysitting services. Mom, please, don't do this. We can work things out. We can, I agreed, but it will be on different terms. When you're ready to have a real conversation about how I've been treated, and when you're ready to set some boundaries with your wife about respecting your mother, I'll be here. But I won't be your financial safety net while you allow her to treat me like garbage. I ended the call before he could respond, my hands shaking as I set the phone aside. The conversation had been harder than I'd anticipated, but necessary. For the first time in years, I'd spoken my truth instead of swallowing it to keep the peace. Driving home, I found myself taking a different route than usual, past the Pine Valley Community Center, where a small sign advertised evening pottery classes. I'd always been drawn to working with clay, something about the tactile nature of shaping something beautiful from raw materials. But Frank had always dismissed it as frivolous, and I'd never made time for myself anyway, too busy managing everyone else's needs. On impulse, I pulled into the parking lot and went inside. The community center smelled of coffee and floor wax, familiar and comforting. A woman with short silver hair and paint-stained aprons was setting up easels in one of the rooms. "Excuse me," I said, approaching her. "I saw the sign about pottery classes." She turned, revealing a face lined with laugh lines and bright, intelligent eyes. "I'm Sandra Torres," she said, extending a clay-dusted hand. "Are you interested in joining us?" "I think I might be. I'm Linda Hayes." "Wonderful. We meet Tuesdays and Thursdays, 7 to 9. It's a small group, very informal." "Have you worked with clay before?" "Not since high school," I admitted. "It's been about 40 years. Sandra laughed, a warm sound that filled the space between us. "Clay has a long memory. It will remember your hands, even if you think you've forgotten how to use them." I signed up on the spot, paying for a full session with the money I'd been saving for Marcus and Brianna's anniversary gift. The irony wasn't lost on me, using funds intended to show love for my son to instead invest in something purely for myself. That evening, Frank came home to find me sitting at the kitchen table, reading a pottery handbook I'd picked up at the bookstore. He looked tired, his work clothes dusty, and his shoulders stooped from a long day at the mill. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the book as he loosened his tie. "I signed up for pottery classes," I said, surprised by how defiant the words sounded. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Pottery? What for?" "For me," I replied simply. "Because I want to." He stared at me for a moment, as if trying to process this information. In our 38 years of marriage, I'd rarely done anything purely for my own enjoyment. My hobbies, such as they were, had always served some practical purpose. Gardening provided vegetables for our table. Knitting produced scarves and sweaters for the family. Even my part-time job at the bookstore had been framed as a way to bring in extra money rather than an activity I genuinely enjoyed. "Pottery," he repeated, settling into his chair across from me. "That seems sudden." I told him about the morning, about the rejected muffins and the conversation with Marcus. I watched his face as I spoke, looking for signs of understanding, of support, of recognition that his wife had been profoundly hurt and was trying to heal. Instead, I saw discomfort and something that looked like disapproval. "You took yourself off Marcus's loan?" he said when I finished. "Linda, that boy is our son. Family helps family." Even when family doesn't help back? I asked. Even when family treats you like you're disposable? Frank rubbed his forehead, a gesture I recognized as his way of dealing with complications he didn't want to face. Brianna's young. She'll learn. She's 28, Frank. She's not a child. And she's had 3 years to learn how to treat me with basic respect. Instead, she's gotten worse. Maybe you're being too sensitive. The words hit me like a slap. Too sensitive. How many times had I been told that over the years? How many times had I internalized that judgment, convincing myself that my hurt feelings were evidence of weakness rather than a reasonable response to poor treatment? Maybe, I said quietly. I haven't been sensitive enough. Maybe I've been so afraid of making waves that I've allowed myself to become invisible in my own family. Frank looked genuinely confused. You're not invisible, Linda. You're the heart of this family. When was the last time you asked me what I wanted, Frank? Not what I needed, not what would be practical, but what I wanted. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, apparently unable to come up with an answer. When was the last time you noticed that I was unhappy? That I was lonely? That I felt taken for granted? You never said anything, he protested. I shouldn't have to. After 38 years of marriage, you should know me well enough to see when I'm struggling. That night, I lay in bed beside Frank, listening to his steady breathing and thinking about the day's revelations. The pottery class, the bank appointment, the difficult conversation with Marcus. They all felt like pieces of a puzzle I was finally beginning to assemble. The picture emerging was of a woman who had spent so much time meeting everyone else's needs that she'd forgotten she had any of her own. The next morning, I called in sick to the bookstore for the first time in 5 years. I wasn't physically ill, but something inside me felt broken and in need of repair. Instead of going to work, I drove to Portland to visit Nicole. My daughter lived in a craftsman-style house in the Hawthorne district, a vibrant neighborhood full of coffee shops, vintage stores, and young families. She worked as a graphic designer from a home office, her creativity evident in every corner of her beautifully decorated space. Mom! She opened the door with a surprised smile, then took a closer look at my face. What's wrong? You look like... You've been crying. I think I'm having what people call a midlife crisis, I said, attempting a laugh that came out more like a sob. Nicole pulled me inside, settling me on her couch with a cup of herbal tea and a box of tissues. I told her everything, from the morning's humiliation to the afternoon's rebellion to Frank's dismissive response. Good for you, she said when I finished. Good for me? I repeated, startled by her reaction. Mom, I've been watching Brianna treat you like dirt for 3 years. I've been watching Marcus turn into someone I barely recognize, someone who cares more about keeping his wife happy than protecting his mother. And I've been watching you shrink smaller and smaller, trying to take up less space so you won't inconvenience anyone. Her words were like a mirror, reflecting truths I'd been avoiding. I thought I was keeping the peace. Whose peace? Nicole asked gently. Not yours. You've been miserable, Mom. Anyone with eyes could see it. Your father says I'm being too sensitive. Nicole made a sound of disgust. Dad's been coasting on autopilot for so long he wouldn't notice if you disappeared entirely, which, in a way, you have. We talked for hours, my daughter helping me see patterns I'd been blind to, validating feelings I'd been taught to dismiss. When I finally left her house that evening, I felt simultaneously drained and energized, as if I'd been holding my breath for years and was finally learning to breathe again. The pottery class that Tuesday was a revelation. The community center's art room was warm and welcoming, filled with the earthy smell of clay and the quiet conversation of people focused on creating something beautiful. There were 8 of us, in total, ranging in age from a college student named Amy to a retired professor named George who reminded me of my father. Sandra was a patient teacher, showing us how to center the clay on the wheel, how to open it up with gentle pressure, how to coax walls up from the spinning mass. My first attempts were disasters, lopsided bowls that collapsed under their own weight, but Sandra just smiled and helped me wedge new clay. "The clay will teach you," she said as I struggled with my third attempt. "You just have to listen to what it wants to become." Sitting at that pottery wheel, my hands covered in slip and my focus completely absorbed in the spinning clay, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the fragile peace of suppressed conflict, but the deep peace of being completely present in the moment, engaged in something that served no purpose other than my own joy. After class, George approached me as I was cleaning up. "First time?" he asked, nodding toward my collection of failed attempts. "Is it that obvious?" He laughed, a warm sound that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "We all started somewhere. The important thing is that you started." "I'm not sure why I'm here," I admitted. "A few days ago, I was a completely different person." "Were you?" he asked thoughtfully. "Or were you just hiding who you really were?" His question stayed with me as I drove home, past the familiar landmarks of Cedar Falls that seemed to be shifting in meaning daily. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw Marcus's truck parked in front of the house. My stomach clenched with anxiety, but beneath it was something new, something that felt like determination. I found Marcus and Frank in the living room, their conversation stopping abruptly when I entered. Marcus looked tired, older somehow than he had just a few days earlier. Frank wore the expression of a man who'd been recruited into a battle he didn't want to fight. "We need to talk, Mom," Marcus said without preamble. "I agree," I replied, settling into my favorite chair and folding my hands in my lap. "But first, I have something to say." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised from a baby, and felt a complicated mixture of love and disappointment. "I love you, Marcus. I've loved you from the moment you were born, and I will love you until the day I die. But I will not continue to accept being treated as less than human by your wife while you stand by and allow it." "Mom, you're being dramatic. Brianna doesn't—" "Stop," I said firmly, holding up a hand. "I'm talking now. You can listen or you can leave, but you will not dismiss my feelings or gaslight me into believing my experiences aren't real." Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but Marcus fell silent, perhaps startled by the steel in my voice. "For 3 years I have watched your wife systematically exclude me from your life. She has criticized my cooking, rearranged my contributions to family gatherings, made decisions about events I was hosting without consulting me, and generally treated me as if I were an inconvenience she had to tolerate. And you, my son, have said nothing." "She's just particular about things," Marcus mumbled. "No," I said sharply. "She's territorial and controlling, and she's decided that I'm a threat to her dominance in your life. The problem isn't that she feels that way. The problem is that you've allowed her to act on those feelings at my expense." I stood up, needing to move, to use my body to emphasize the words that had been trapped inside me for so long. "Yesterday morning I brought you anniversary muffins. Muffins made with love, with tradition, with the hope of celebrating an important milestone in your life. And your wife rejected them without a second thought, as if they were garbage from a stranger instead of a gift from your mother." Marcus's face flushed. "She explained that. We're trying to eat healthier." "Those muffins weren't about eating, Marcus. They were about love. They were about connection. They were about honoring a tradition that goes back 3 generations in our family." And she threw them back in my face while you stood there and said nothing. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a wedding gift from Frank's parents that had marked time through nearly 4 decades of marriage. "What do you want from me?" Marcus asked finally, his voice smaller than before. "I want you to see me," I said simply. "I want you to remember that I'm not just a convenience for when you need money or babysitting. I'm your mother, and I deserve to be treated with respect and love, especially by my own family." And if we can't give you what you want? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that terrified me. But I had come too far in these past few days to back down now. Then we'll have a very different relationship than we've had, I said quietly. One with much clearer boundaries and much less involvement from me. Marcus left that night without resolution, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. Frank went to bed early, claiming he had a headache, but I suspected he was simply overwhelmed by this new version of his wife, one who spoke her mind and made demands. I sat in my kitchen long after they'd gone, surrounded by the familiar objects of my domestic life, but feeling like a stranger in my own home. The journey I'd begun with a rejected basket of muffins was far from over. In fact, I was beginning to realize it had barely begun. 3 weeks had passed since my confrontation with Marcus, and Cedar Falls felt like a different town entirely. The changes weren't dramatic or sudden, but they were profound, like the slow shifting of seasons that transforms the landscape 1 degree at a time. I found myself noticing things I'd overlooked for years. The way morning light slanted through, the windows of the coffee shop on Pine Street, the intricate stonework on the old library building, the sound of children's laughter echoing from the elementary school playground. My pottery classes had become the anchor of my week, something I looked forward to with an intensity that surprised me. Under Sandra's patient guidance, I was finally managing to coax recognizable shapes from the clay. My bowls were still lopsided, and my mugs leaked from hairline cracks, but there was something deeply satisfying about creating objects with my own hands. Something that existed purely because I had willed it into being. "You're loosening up," Sandra observed during our Thursday session, watching as I worked on what might eventually become a vase. "When you first started, you were fighting the clay. Now you're working with it." George, the retired professor, who had become my unofficial pottery mentor, nodded approvingly from his wheel beside mine. "Reminds me of what Rumi wrote," he said, his hands never pausing in their careful shaping. "Let yourself be silently drawn by the strange pull of what you really love. It will not lead you astray." The words resonated in ways I couldn't fully articulate. For the first time in decades, I was being drawn by something that had nothing to do with duty or obligation or making others comfortable. I was following my own strange pull, and it was leading me somewhere I'd never been before. The changes in my daily life were accumulating in ways that felt both subtle and revolutionary. I'd started taking morning walks through downtown Cedar Falls, exploring neighborhoods I'd driven through but never really seen. I discovered a used bookstore tucked between the hardware store and the dry cleaner, its narrow aisles packed with treasures that the owner, an elderly woman named Ruth, was always eager to discuss. "You're becoming quite the regular," Ruth observed one morning as I browsed her poetry section. "What's got you reading so much Adrienne Rich?" I paused, considering her question. "I think I'm trying to remember who I was before I became who everyone else needed me to be." Ruth smiled, her eyes crinkling with understanding. "Ah, the Great Excavation Project. I did that myself about 20 years ago. Fair warning, you might not like everything you uncover, but you'll be more yourself than you've been in years." Her words proved prophetic. As I began paying attention to my own thoughts and feelings instead of constantly monitoring everyone else's, I started noticing patterns that made me uncomfortable. The way I automatically apologized for things that weren't my fault. The way I downplayed my own opinions in conversations, prefacing them with phrases like, "I might be wrong, but," or "This is probably silly, but." The way I'd trained myself to scan every room for what needed to be done, what needed to be fixed, who needed to be taken care of. It was exhausting, I realized. Being the perpetual caretaker, the one who anticipated everyone's needs and met them before they were even expressed, was absolutely exhausting. And worse, it had made me invisible to the very people I was caring for. They'd come to expect my constant attention and service as the natural order of things, as inevitable as sunrise or seasons changing. The revelation hit me with particular force one evening when Frank came home from work and stood in the kitchen, clearly waiting for something. When I didn't immediately spring into action, he shifted restlessly from foot to foot. "Dinner?" he finally asked, the word carrying a weight of expectation that had accumulated over nearly 4 decades of marriage. "What about it?" I replied, not looking up from the book I was reading at the kitchen table. Frank stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "Aren't you making dinner?" I hadn't planned on it. "There's sandwich meat in the refrigerator, and I think we have some of that soup you like in the pantry." The silence that followed was profound. Frank stood there for several minutes, apparently processing the novel concept that dinner might not appear automatically at 6:30, prepared according to his preferences and served at the table without any effort on his part. "Is this about the pottery thing?" he asked finally. "It's about me learning to take care of myself instead of just taking care of everyone else," I replied, marking my place in the book and giving him my full attention. "When was the last time you cooked dinner, Frank?" He looked genuinely confused by the question. "I don't cook." "You don't cook, or you've never had to cook because I've always done it?" "You're better at it." "I'm practiced at it," I corrected. "There's a difference. I'm practiced at it because I've been doing it every single day for 38 years, while you've been practicing other things." Frank made himself a sandwich that night, fumbling through the process with the deliberate movements of someone performing an unfamiliar task. He ate it standing at the counter, shooting occasional glances in my direction as if waiting for me to return to my usual role. But I stayed at the table with my book, discovering that I quite enjoyed the quiet luxury of reading without the background mental noise of meal planning and dishwashing. The next morning, Frank made his own coffee and toast, then left for work, with a stiff goodbye that suggested he was not adjusting well to this new domestic arrangement. I found I didn't particularly care. For the first time in our marriage, I was putting my own needs on equal footing with his, and if that made him uncomfortable, that was something he would have to work through. My relationship with the bookstore had also evolved in unexpected ways. What had started as a part-time job to bring in extra money had become something closer to a calling. I found myself staying after hours to reorganize sections, to create displays that might help customers discover new authors, to research ordering recommendations for patrons with specific interests. "You've got a real gift for this," my supervisor Janet told me one afternoon as we reviewed the sales figures for my personally curated mystery section. "Have you ever thought about increasing your hours? We could use someone with your passion for full-time." The offer was tempting, but it also felt like a test of the new boundaries I was establishing. The old Linda would have immediately said yes, eager to please and afraid to disappoint. The new Linda paused to consider what she actually wanted. "Let me think about it," I said, surprising us both. "I want to make sure I'm making decisions based on what's right for me, not just what seems expected." Janet smiled. "That sounds very wise. Take your time." But the most significant changes were happening in my relationship with my own family. Marcus had called twice since our confrontation, both conversations stilted and uncomfortable. He seemed to be waiting for me to return to my previous role as the accommodating mother who prioritized his comfort above her own dignity. When that didn't happen, when I maintained the boundaries I'd established, he grew increasingly frustrated. "You're being stubborn, Mom," he said during our most recent call. "Brianna feels terrible about the whole muffin thing. She wants to make it right." "What does making it right look like to her?" I asked. "She thought maybe you could come over this weekend. She'll cook dinner, and you two can talk." I almost laughed at the presumption. So her idea of making amends is to invite me to her house so she can manage the conversation on her territory? "It's a gesture, Mom. She's trying." A gesture would be calling me herself to apologize for her behavior. A gesture would be acknowledging that she's been disrespectful and committing to change. Having her husband relay an invitation isn't making amends, Marcus. It's maintaining control of the narrative. The conversation ended with Marcus hanging up in frustration, and I found that I felt lighter rather than heavier afterward. For decades, I'd been so afraid of conflict, so desperate to maintain harmony, that I'd allowed myself to be diminished rather than risk making anyone uncomfortable. Now I was discovering that conflict, when it was honest and necessary, could be clarifying rather than destructive. Nicole had become my unexpected ally in this process of self-discovery. She called regularly, checking in on my progress and offering perspective when I doubted the changes I was making. "You sound different, Mom," she told me during one of our evening conversations. "More present somehow. More like yourself." "I'm not sure I know who that is yet," I admitted. "I'm still figuring it out." "That's okay. You've got time." The pottery class had introduced me to a community I'd never known existed in Cedar Falls. Beyond George and Sandra, there were others who shared stories over clay-covered coffee cups after each session. Amy, the college student, was working through anxiety by creating intricate miniature sculptures. Helen, a widow in her 70s, had taken up ceramics after her husband's death as a way of learning that she could still create beautiful things, even in the midst of grief. "It's funny," Helen observed one evening as we cleaned up our workspace. "I spent 50 years taking care of Harold, making sure he had everything he needed. After he died, I thought my usefulness was over. But it turns out I was useful to myself all along. I just never gave myself permission to be." Her words resonated deeply. I'd spent so many years being useful to others that I'd forgotten I had value beyond what I could provide. The pottery class was teaching me that I could create something beautiful simply for the joy of creating it, that my hands had value beyond their ability to serve meals and fold laundry and provide comfort to others. One evening after class, as George and I were loading our latest creations into my car for the journey home, he made an observation that stopped me in my tracks. "You know," he said, carefully settling a bowl I'd made into a padded box, "when I first retired, I thought my life was essentially over. I'd defined myself by my work for so long that I couldn't imagine who I'd be without it. But retirement taught me something interesting. It taught me that transformation isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose, again and again, every day." I thought about his words as I drove home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. Transformation as a choice rather than an accident. The idea felt both empowering and daunting. It meant that the changes I was experiencing weren't something that had happened to me because of Marcus and Brianna's behavior, but something I was actively choosing in response to it. The house was dark when I arrived home, Frank already asleep, despite the early hour. I found myself grateful for the solitude, for the space to move through my own home without having to manage anyone else's needs or expectations. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the living room, looking around at the furniture and decorations that had defined my domestic life for so many years. Everything in the room reflected Frank's tastes or practical considerations rather than my own preferences. The brown leather sofa he'd insisted was more practical than the fabric one I'd admired. The heavy wooden coffee table that was sturdy but graceless. The landscape paintings that were pleasant but uninspiring. Even the throw pillows were chosen for their ability to hide stains rather than their beauty. When had I stopped having opinions about my own environment? When had I become so focused on creating a space that worked for everyone else that I'd forgotten to consider what would make me happy? I pulled out my phone and began browsing home decorating websites, something I'd never done before. Color palettes and furniture arrangements that had nothing to do with practicality or other people's preferences. I found myself drawn to unexpected combinations. Deep jewel tones paired with warm woods, eclectic mixes of vintage and modern pieces, spaces that felt curated and personal rather than merely functional. "What are you looking at?" Frank's voice startled me. I looked up to find him standing in the doorway in his pajamas, squinting in the lamplight. Interior design ideas, I said, not bothering to hide the screen. He moved closer, peering over my shoulder at images of rooms that looked nothing like our current living space. Those look expensive, he said after a moment. Some of them. Others are just different. Different how? I considered his question. More personal, more reflective of individual taste rather than what's expected or practical. Frank settled into his recliner, apparently resigned to being awake. Are you thinking of redecorating? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications neither of us was quite ready to address. Was I thinking of redecorating? Or was I thinking of something larger, something that would require more than new throw pillows and a fresh coat of paint? I'm thinking of making some changes, I said finally. I'm not sure yet what all of them will be. We sat in silence. For a while, the space between us filled with unspoken questions and uncertainties. Finally, Frank spoke. I don't understand what's happening with you, Linda. You're different, distant. It's like you're becoming someone I don't recognize. His words should have hurt, but instead they felt like a confirmation. Maybe you never really knew who I was to begin with, I suggested gently. Maybe I never let you see her because I was so busy being who you needed me to be. I never asked you to be anyone but yourself. The statement was so disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. Frank, when was the last time you asked me what I wanted, what I dreamed about, what made me happy or sad or afraid? He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, apparently unable to come up with an answer. You never asked because you never had to, I continued. I made it my job to anticipate what you needed and provide it before you even knew you wanted it. I smoothed every rough edge, managed every inconvenience, solved every problem. I made myself so useful that you never had to wonder about me as a separate person with my own inner life. That sounds lonely, Frank said quietly. It was, I agreed. It is. But I'm learning that loneliness isn't necessarily a problem to be solved by other people. Sometimes it's information about what needs to change. The next morning, I woke with unusual clarity about what I needed to do next. After Frank left for work, I called Janet at the bookstore. I've been thinking about your offer, I said without preamble. I'd like to take on more hours, but I want to propose something different than what we discussed. I'm listening. I'd like to create a community programming position for myself. Book clubs, author events, literacy programs for adults. Things that would use my skills, but also contribute something meaningful to Cedar Falls. There was a pause. That's ambitious. We'd have to run it by the owner, work out funding, develop a proposal. I know, but I think I'm ready for ambitious. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling a familiar mixture of terror and exhilaration. I was proposing to create a job that didn't exist, to contribute to my community in ways that had nothing to do with taking care of individual people's immediate needs. It was selfish in the best possible way, a choice based purely on what I wanted to do with my skills and energy. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and I took a deep breath before answering. Mom, we need to talk. Brianna and I are coming over tonight. The presumption in his tone, the assumption that he could simply announce his arrival and expect me to be available, triggered something that had been building for weeks. No, I said simply. What? No, you're not coming over tonight. You're not announcing visits to my home and expecting me to accommodate them. If you want to have a conversation, you can ask politely for a time that works for both of us. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, he spoke, his voice tight with barely contained anger. Fine. Mom, would you please find time in your apparently very busy schedule to meet with your son and daughter-in-law? The sarcasm was thick, but beneath it, I could hear something else. Hurt, maybe. or fear. The realization that his mother was no longer the predictable, manageable person she'd been for his entire life. "I'm free Saturday afternoon," I said calmly. "You can come here at 2 o'clock. And Marcus? Come prepared for an honest conversation, not a performance designed to get me back in line." As I hung up the phone, I felt the familiar flutter of anxiety about conflict, about disappointing people I loved. But underneath it was something stronger and steadier. The deep satisfaction of a woman who was finally learning to take up the space she deserved in her own life. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp December weather that made Cedar Falls look like a postcard. Snow had fallen overnight, dusting the evergreens and softening the edges of the familiar landscape. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the world transform under its white blanket, and felt a strange sense of anticipation mixed with dread about the afternoon ahead. I'd spent the morning at the community center, working on a large ceramic piece that had been evolving over several sessions. Sandra called it my breakthrough piece, something that showed real confidence and personal style. The vase was taller than anything I'd attempted before, with flowing lines that reminded me of dancing figures or wind-blown grass. Working on it had become a form of meditation, a way of centering myself before difficult conversations. "You're different when you're at the wheel," George had observed during our last class. "More yourself somehow, like you've finally given yourself permission to exist." His words stayed with me as I prepared for Marcus and Brianna's visit. I'd chosen my clothing carefully, not to impress them, but to feel authentic in my own skin. A deep emerald sweater that brought out the green in my eyes, paired with dark jeans and the leather boots I'd bought myself the week before. Looking in the mirror, I saw a woman who was both familiar and foreign, someone who had emerged from decades of careful self-effacement into something more vivid and present. Frank had made himself scarce for the afternoon, claiming he needed to run errands that could easily have waited until Monday. I suspected he was avoiding what he sensed would be an uncomfortable confrontation, and I was grateful for his absence. This conversation needed to happen without the buffer of his discomfort or his attempts to smooth over the sharp edges of truth. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard Marcus's truck pull into the driveway, followed by the slam of 2 doors. Through the window, I watched my son and daughter-in-law walk toward the house, their body language tense and purposeful. Brianna wore her armor of professional perfection, a tailored coat and high-heeled boots that were impractical for Oregon winter weather. Marcus looked uncomfortable in his dress shirt and khakis, clearly instructed to present a more formal version of himself. I opened the door before they could knock, taking control of the interaction from the first moment. "Marcus, Brianna, come in." They entered my home with the wariness of people entering enemy territory, their eyes scanning the familiar space as if looking for evidence of the changes they sensed in me. I led them to the living room, gesturing toward the sofa while I settled into my own chair, the positioning deliberate. This was my home, my conversation to lead. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice steady despite the rapid beating of my heart. "I appreciate you making time for this discussion." Brianna shifted uncomfortably, crossing and uncrossing her legs. "Linda, I want to start by saying how sorry I am about the misunderstanding with the muffins. I was having a stressful morning, and I reacted poorly." The apology was carefully crafted, hitting the right notes while managing to minimize the incident and avoid taking real responsibility. A misunderstanding, not a deliberate slight. A poor reaction to stress, not a pattern of disrespectful behavior. "Thank you for acknowledging that," I replied evenly. "But I don't think what happened was a misunderstanding. I think it was exactly what it appeared to be. A continuation of a pattern of behavior that's been building for 3 years." Marcus leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "Mom, you're making this bigger than it needs to be. Can't we just move past it?" "No," I said simply. "We can't move past it because it keeps happening." The muffin incident was just the most recent example of something that's been going on since the day you got married. I looked directly at Brianna, refusing to let her avoid eye contact. You've systematically worked to diminish my place in Marcus's life. You've criticized my contributions to family gatherings, rearranged things I've organized, made decisions about events without consulting me, and generally treated me as if I were an inconvenience you had to endure rather than a member of this family. That's not fair, Brianna protested, her composure beginning to crack. I've never done anything deliberately hurtful. Haven't you? I asked quietly. Last Christmas, when I spent hours decorating the dining room for our family dinner. You waited until I left to redo everything because it wasn't sophisticated enough for your standards. At Easter, you threw away the centerpiece I'd made and replaced it with one from an expensive florist. You've dismissed my recipes, criticized my housekeeping, and made it clear at every opportunity that my way of doing things isn't good enough for your elevated standards. Marcus's face was flushing red, a sign I recognized from his childhood when he was caught in wrongdoing he couldn't deny. Mom, maybe you're being too sensitive about these things. The familiar phrase, the same, one Frank had used, hit me like an expected slap. But this time, instead of accepting the judgment, I turned it back on them. Too sensitive, I repeated slowly. Do you know how often I've been told that over the years? How many times I've accepted that my hurt feelings were evidence of weakness, rather than reasonable responses to poor treatment? I stood up, needing to move, to use my whole body to communicate what I was saying. I'm not too sensitive, Marcus. I'm appropriately sensitive. When someone treats me with disrespect, it should hurt. When my own family dismisses my feelings and minimizes my experiences, it should be painful. The problem isn't that I feel these things. The problem is that I've been trained to believe my feelings don't matter. Brianna's mask of contrition was slipping, revealing something harder underneath. I've tried to have a good relationship with you, Linda, but you make it difficult. How do I make it difficult? You're always around, always wanting to help, to be involved, to have an opinion about things that aren't really your business anymore. The honesty was startling, even refreshing in its directness. Finally, we were getting to the truth beneath the polite facade. Things that aren't my business, I repeated. Like my son's anniversary? Like family gatherings in my own home? Like traditions that have been part of our family for generations? Like our marriage, Brianna said, her voice rising slightly. Like our decisions about how we want to live our lives. You act like Marcus still belongs to you, like I'm just borrowing him. I felt something click into place, a puzzle piece that made the whole picture suddenly clear. You see me as competition, I said with dawning realization. You think loving his mother somehow takes away from loving his wife, don't you? She shot back. Don't you think Marcus should prioritize his wife over his mother? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with years of unspoken resentment and territorial disputes I'd been too naive to recognize. I think Marcus should prioritize respect and kindness toward all the people he loves, I said carefully. I think he should be capable of loving his wife without disrespecting his mother. I think those two relationships should enhance each other, not compete. Owie! I turned to look at my son, who had been sitting silently through this exchange, his discomfort obvious in every line of his body. But mostly, I think Marcus should have the courage to speak up when someone he loves is being treated poorly, regardless of who's doing the treating. It's not that simple, Mom, Marcus said, his voice strained. I'm caught in the middle. No, you're not, I replied firmly. You've chosen a side. You've chosen to prioritize Brianna's comfort over my dignity, her preferences over my feelings. That's not being caught in the middle. That's making a choice. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of children playing in the snow outside. Finally, Brianna spoke, her voice tight with controlled anger. What do you want from us, Linda? What would it take to satisfy you? The question was clearly meant to be challenging, to force me into making unreasonable demands that would prove their point about my difficult nature. Instead, I found myself thinking carefully about what I actually wanted. What would constitute a genuine resolution? I want acknowledgement, I said finally. I want you to admit that you've treated me poorly and that it was deliberate, not accidental. I want you to understand that your behavior has consequences, that dismissing and disrespecting me hurts not just me, but the entire family dynamic. I paused, looking between them. And I want changes. Real changes in how you interact with me, how you include me in family decisions, how you speak to me and about me. I want to be treated like a person with value rather than an obligation to be managed. And if we can't do that? Brianna asked, her chin raised defiantly. Then our relationship will reflect that reality, I said simply. I won't continue to put myself in situations where I'm treated with disrespect. I won't continue to prioritize your comfort over my own dignity. I won't be the convenient mother-in-law who shows up when you need something and disappears when you don't. Marcus finally found his voice. You're talking about cutting us out of your life. I'm talking about having a different kind of relationship, one with clear boundaries and mutual respect, one where my presence is valued rather than tolerated. That sounds like an ultimatum, Brianna said. It's not an ultimatum. It's information about what I will and won't accept going forward. You can choose how to respond to that information. The conversation continued for another hour, cycling through anger, defensiveness, and occasional glimpses of understanding. Brianna admitted grudgingly that she had felt threatened by my close relationship with Marcus, that she'd worried his loyalty to me would interfere with their marriage. Marcus acknowledged that he'd taken the path of least resistance, avoiding conflict by allowing his wife to control the family dynamics, even when he knew it was hurting me. But acknowledgement wasn't the same as change, and I found myself wondering if they were capable of the kind of transformation this relationship would require. When they finally left, promising to think about what I'd said, I felt drained but oddly hopeful. Not because I believed they would immediately change, but because I had finally spoken my truth completely and clearly. That evening, Frank returned from his errands with Chinese takeout and a cautious expression. "How did it go?" he asked, setting the containers on the kitchen counter. "Honestly," I said, which seemed to alarm him more than if I'd said it had gone badly. We ate our dinner in relative silence, both of us processing the implications of the afternoon's confrontation. Finally, Frank spoke. "Are you really prepared to lose your relationship with Marcus over this?" The question revealed so much about how he understood the situation, his assumption that I was the one creating distance rather than simply refusing to accept poor treatment anymore. "I'm not losing anything, Frank. I'm refusing to pretend that what we had was actually a relationship. Marcus and I haven't had a real relationship in years. We've had a transaction disguised as a relationship, where I provided services and he provided the illusion of filial affection." That seems harsh. Does it? When was the last time Marcus called me just to talk? When was the last time he asked about my interests, my dreams, my concerns that weren't related to what I could do for him? When was the last time he defended me, or stood up for me, or showed any interest in my well-being beyond making sure I was available when he needed something? Frank had no answer, perhaps because he was recognizing that the same questions could be asked about our own marriage. The next few days passed quietly, with no word from Marcus or Brianna. I found myself oddly at peace with their silence, taking it as evidence that they were actually considering what I'd said, rather than immediately dismissing it. Nicole called to check in, offering support and perspective as she had throughout this process. "How are you feeling about the confrontation?" she asked during one of our evening conversations. "Relieved, mostly," I said, surprising myself with the honesty of the answer. like I finally said things that needed to be said years ago. And scared? I considered her question. Yes, scared too. Scared that they won't change, that I'll lose my relationship with Marcus entirely. But also scared that I've waited so long to value myself that I don't know how to do it consistently. You're learning, Nicole said gently, and you're doing better than you think. Wednesday evening brought an unexpected phone call. Marcus's voice was subdued when I answered. Mom, I've been thinking about what you said, about how I've handled things with Brianna, about the choices I've made. I waited, not wanting to fill the silence with reassurances that would let him off the hook too easily. I think you're right, he continued. I think I have been choosing Brianna's comfort over your feelings. I told myself I was keeping the peace, but really I was just avoiding conflict, even when that conflict was necessary. The admission felt significant, the first crack in the defensive wall he'd built around his marriage. Thank you for acknowledging that, I said carefully. What happens now? I don't know, he admitted. Brianna's pretty angry about the conversation. She feels like you attacked her, like you were trying to damage our marriage. And what do you think? There was a long pause. I think you were trying to save your relationship with me. And I think maybe I haven't been doing my part to protect that relationship. The words brought tears to my eyes, not because they solved everything, but because they suggested that my son was finally beginning to understand what I'd been trying to tell him. I love you, Marcus, I said. I've always loved you. But I can't keep accepting crumbs of affection while pretending they're a feast. I need more from our relationship, and I need you to be willing to work toward that. I want to try, he said quietly. I'm not sure how, but I want to try. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a beginning. A recognition that change was possible, that relationships could evolve and grow even after decades of dysfunction. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to my family relationships. Hope. The pottery. Class that Thursday felt different, lighter somehow, as if the confrontation with Marcus and Brianna had freed up energy I'd been using to maintain false harmony. My hands moved more confidently on the clay, shaping forms that were bolder and more expressive than anything I'd created before. You're centering better, Sandra observed, watching my technique. Not just the clay, but yourself. George nodded approvingly from his wheel. There's something to be said for difficult conversations, he said. They clarify things, even when they don't resolve them. As I worked on my latest creation, a bowl with flowing organic lines that seemed to have emerged from some deep creative, I hadn't known existed. I thought about transformation and truth-telling and the courage required to insist on being seen as fully human. The clay responded to my touch with a cooperation that felt almost magical, as if it recognized that I was finally working from a place of authentic self-expression rather than anxious people-pleasing. When class ended, I lingered to help clean up, reluctant to leave this space where I felt most myself. Sandra approached as I was wiping down my workstation. Linda, I want to talk to you about something, she said. I've been watching your progress, and I think you have real talent. More than that, I think you have something to express through clay that's uniquely yours. I felt a flush of pride mixed with uncertainty. Thank you. That means a lot coming. From you. I'm wondering if you'd be interested in displaying some of your pieces in the community center's next art show. It's in February, and I think your work would be a wonderful addition. The invitation was both thrilling and terrifying. To show my work publicly felt like stepping fully into this new identity I was creating, claiming space as an artist rather than simply someone who took pottery classes for relaxation. I'd like that very much, I heard myself saying, committing to something that would have seemed impossible just months before. Driving home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, I thought about the conversation with Marcus, the pottery class, Sandra's invitation to display my work. Each represented a different aspect of the person I was becoming, someone who spoke her truth even when it was difficult, who pursued her passions without apology, who claimed space in the world based on her own intrinsic value rather than her usefulness to others. The transformation wasn't complete, might never be complete, but it was undeniably real. And for the first time in decades, I was excited to see who I might become next. Spring arrived in Cedar Falls with an abundance that felt almost celebratory. The cherry trees along Pine Street burst into clouds of pink blossoms. The daffodils I'd planted years ago finally multiplied into golden drifts, and the morning air carried the green smell of new growth. It had been 4 months since my confrontation with Marcus and Brianna, 4 months of slow but steady progress toward something that resembled genuine family relationships. The changes hadn't been dramatic or immediate. Real transformation, I'd learned, was more like the patient work of pottery, requiring steady pressure and constant attention to create something beautiful from raw material. Marcus had started calling more regularly, not just when he needed something but to check in, to share small details about his work, or ask about my pottery classes. The conversations were still sometimes awkward, both of us learning how to relate as whole people rather than playing the simplified roles of dutiful son and accommodating mother. Brianna remained a work in progress. She'd made efforts, stiff, and obviously uncomfortable attempts at including me in decisions and acknowledging my contributions to family gatherings. The warmth wasn't there yet, might never be there, but basic respect was slowly taking root. She'd even complimented one of my ceramic pieces when she saw it displayed in the community center, though the words sounded carefully rehearsed. "Your pottery has really improved, Linda," she'd said during their last visit. "That vase is actually quite sophisticated." The qualifier stung, but I recognized it as her version of an olive branch, an attempt to bridge the gap between us without fully admitting fault. I was learning to accept incremental progress rather than demanding complete transformation overnight. Frank had perhaps undergone the most surprising evolution. The man who had dismissed my pottery classes as frivolous now regularly asked about my latest pieces, even stopping by the community center to see my work displayed in the February art show. He'd stood for a long time in front of my favorite piece, a tall vase with flowing lines that reminded viewers of wind through wheat fields. "I never knew you could create something like this," he'd said quietly, genuine wonder in his voice. "Neither did I'd replied, and we'd shared a moment of mutual recognition that we were both discovering who I was beneath the roles I'd played for so long. Our marriage was still finding its new equilibrium. Frank had learned to cook basics, meals, do his own laundry, and manage household tasks that had been my sole responsibility for decades. More importantly, he'd begun asking questions about my inner life, my dreams and fears and hopes, as if finally recognizing that I was a separate person rather than an extension of his needs. The conversations were sometimes clumsy, decades of emotional shortcuts requiring patient rewiring, but they were happening. We were learning to be companions rather than simply cohabitants, to share space as equals rather than as caretaker and recipient of care. The bookstore had become the unexpected center of my professional renaissance. Janet had approved my proposal for community programming, and I'd thrown myself into creating events that brought people together around books and ideas. The monthly author readings were drawing crowds from throughout the region, and the adult literacy program I'd developed was helping a dozen Cedar Falls residents improve their reading skills. "You've transformed this place," Janet told me one afternoon as we reviewed the sales figures that showed consistent growth since I'd expanded my role. "You've made it a real community hub rather than just a retail space." The work felt meaningful in ways my previous volunteer activities never had. Instead of simply filling gaps or meeting immediate needs, I was creating something lasting, something that would continue to benefit Cedar Falls long after I was gone. It was legacy work, the kind of contribution that reflected my values and utilized my talents rather than just my willingness to show up and help. Ruth, the owner of the used bookstore where I'd become a regular customer, had become an unexpected mentor and friend. Our conversations over tea and poetry had helped me understand that my journey wasn't unique, that many women my age were rediscovering themselves after decades of self-sacrifice. The trick, she'd told me one afternoon as we discussed Mary, Oliver's work, isn't to regret the years you spent caring for others. It's to integrate that caring with caring for yourself, to find ways to serve the world that also serve your soul. Her words had guided my approach to rebuilding relationships with my family. I was learning to love them while also loving myself, to contribute to their well-being without sacrificing my own. It was a delicate balance, requiring constant attention and adjustment, but it felt sustainable in ways my previous approach never had. The pottery had evolved from hobby to genuine artistic practice. Sandra had become not just an instructor, but a friend and guide, helping me develop techniques that allowed me to express increasingly complex emotions through clay. My pieces were being accepted into regional shows, and I'd even sold several through a gallery in Portland that specialized in work by emerging artists. "You're not emerging anymore," George had observed during our Thursday evening class. "You've arrived. The question now is where you want to go next." The question of what came next had been on my mind increasingly as spring deepened into early summer. I was approaching my 63rd birthday, an age when many people were thinking about winding down rather than expanding their horizons. But the woman I'd become over these past months felt like she was just getting started. The conversation that would reshape my understanding of possibility came from an unexpected source. Nicole had driven down from Portland for a weekend visit, and we were sitting on my back porch, watching the roses I'd neglected for months somehow manage to bloom more abundantly than ever. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice carrying an excitement she was trying to contain. "David and I have been talking, and we want to make you an offer." David was Nicole's husband, a software developer who worked remotely and had been increasingly frustrated with Portland's cost of living and urban pressures. They'd been considering a move but hadn't been sure where to relocate. "We want to move to Cedar Falls," Nicole continued. "We want to buy a house here so Emma and Jake can grow up knowing their grandmother the way I never really knew mine. But more than that, we want to be part of what you're building here." The offer was more complex than simple proximity. David's tech skills could help expand the bookstore's online presence and create digital programs that would reach beyond Cedar Falls. Nicole's graphic design expertise could support my community programming efforts and help local artists and businesses with their marketing needs. "We're talking about creating something together," Nicole explained. "A family business that combines all our skills and serves the community in ways that matter. You've shown us what's possible when someone refuses to accept limitations and starts creating the life they actually want." The proposal was both thrilling and terrifying. It would mean even bigger changes, more visibility, greater responsibility. But it also represented the kind of collaborative partnership I'd been craving without knowing how to name it. "I need time to think about it," I said, though part of me wanted to say yes immediately. "Of course. David and I are prepared to wait while you decide. But Mom, I want you to know how proud I am of who you've become. You've shown me what courage looks like, what it means to value yourself enough to demand better." That evening, I called Marcus to tell him about Nicole's proposal. His response surprised me with its enthusiasm. "That sounds amazing, Mom. Nicole's right. You have created something special here. And honestly, I think it would be good for our kids to grow up around you more, to see the example you're setting. Our kids." The casual reference to the grandchildren I hope to have someday, the assumption that I would be an integral part of their lives, felt like a gift. Marcus was finally thinking of me as someone who would contribute positively to his family's future rather than someone whose needs had to be managed. "Brianna might be interested in the real estate opportunities," he continued. "If Nicole and David are moving here, other young families might follow. Cedar Falls could use that kind of growth." It was the first time Marcus had suggested that Brianna and I might work together rather than simply coexist. The idea was intriguing, a possible foundation for the respectful relationship I'd been hoping we might eventually build. The decision to accept Nicole's proposal came to me gradually, like clay slowly taking shape under patient hands. I discussed it with Frank, who surprised me by being immediately supportive. "I've watched you bloom over these past months," he said. "I'd be crazy to stand in the way of more blooming." I talked it through with Sandra and George, with Ruth and Janet, with all the people who had become part of my support network during this period of transformation. Their encouragement was unanimous, but more importantly, they helped me recognize that the decision was mine to make based on my own desires, rather than everyone else's expectations. The planning began in earnest in June. Nicole and David found a house just 6 blocks from mine, a craftsman bungalow with a large yard perfect for their children and space for David's home office. We began developing business plans for expanding the bookstore's mission, creating programming that would serve the broader region while anchoring our efforts in Cedar Falls. Frank surprised everyone, including himself, by asking to be part of the planning process. His decades of practical experience and his understanding of Cedar Falls' economic landscape proved invaluable as we worked out the details of our expansion. "I feel useful again," he told me one evening as we reviewed financial projections. "Not just needed, but useful. There's a difference." I understood exactly what he meant. Being needed implied that others couldn't function without you, that your value lay in your indispensability. Being useful meant that you contributed something valuable because of who you were, not because of what others lacked. The art show. In July was my first major exhibition, 12 pieces displayed in the community center's main gallery alongside work by established regional artists. The opening reception drew more people than any previous community center event, locals mixing, with visitors from throughout Oregon who had come specifically to see the show. Marcus and Brianna attended, bringing several friends and making a point of introducing me as my mother, the artist, to everyone they met. The pride in Marcus's voice was unmistakable, a far cry from the embarrassed tolerance he'd shown toward my interests just months before. Frank stood beside my largest piece, a sculptural vase nearly 4 feet tall with intricate carved patterns that had taken months to complete. I found him there as the evening was winding down, staring at the piece with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Penny for your thoughts," I said, moving to stand beside him. "I was thinking about all the years I lived with an artist and never knew it," he said quietly. "All the creativity you must have had bottled up, all the beauty you might have created if I'd been paying attention." "We can't change the past," I replied, taking his hand. "But we can make sure the future is different." He squeezed my fingers, a gesture that felt like a promise. The success of the art show led to opportunities I'd never imagined. A gallery in Seattle offered to represent my work. A pottery studio in Portland invited me to teach weekend workshops. The local arts council asked me to serve on a committee planning a regional sculpture park. Each opportunity represented a choice about who I wanted to become and how I wanted to spend the years ahead. The woman I'd been 6 months ago would have felt overwhelmed by so many options, paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong choice. The woman I was becoming approached each decision with curiosity rather than anxiety, confident that she could handle whatever consequences followed. The family dinner that marked my 63rd birthday in August felt different from any celebration we'd had in years. Nicole and David had moved to Cedar Falls the week before, their children delighted with the adventure of a new town and the proximity to their grandmother. Marcus and Brianna seemed genuinely relaxed, no longer walking on eggshells around me or managing my reactions to their choices. Frank had insisted on cooking the entire meal himself, an ambitious undertaking that resulted in slightly overcooked salmon and underdone vegetables, but tasted delicious because of the love and effort he'd invested in its preparation. "To Linda," he said, raising his glass of wine as we gathered around the dining room table I'd set with my good china. To the woman who taught us all that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. The toast brought tears to my eyes, not because it was perfectly worded, but because it represented Frank's recognition of my journey and his own growth alongside it. We were becoming the couple we might have been all along if we'd learned earlier how to see each other completely. After dessert, as the family scattered to help with cleanup or entertain the children, Brianna approached me in the kitchen. Her usual polish was softened somehow, her expression more genuine than I'd seen in years. "Linda, I owe you an apology," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "Not just for the muffin thing, but for everything. For 3 years of treating you like a threat instead of recognizing that you were a gift to our family." The words were more than I'd dared hope for, an acknowledgement that went beyond surface politeness to real understanding. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means more than you know." "I was scared," she continued. "Scared that Marcus would choose loyalty to you over commitment to me. Scared that I'd never be enough if I had to compete with 30 years of history. But I realize now that love isn't a zero-sum game. Marcus loving you doesn't diminish his love for me." It was perhaps the most honest conversation we'd ever had, the first time Brianna had let me see her vulnerability instead of just her defenses. "I'd like to try again," she said. "To build a real relationship instead of just managing our interactions. I think I could learn a lot from you, from the courage you've shown in rebuilding your life." As I hugged my daughter-in-law, feeling genuine warmth pass between us for the first time, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. It had begun with rejected muffins and a desperate phone call to a bank, with the devastating recognition that I'd become invisible in my own life. It had required months of difficult conversations, of learning to value myself enough to demand better treatment, of discovering interests and talents I'd buried for decades. But it had led to this, to a family dinner where everyone was present not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire to be together, to relationships built on mutual respect, rather than careful management of hurt feelings, to a life that felt expansive rather than constrictive, full of possibility rather than resignation. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and Frank had fallen asleep, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the woman I'd been and the woman I was becoming. The transformation wasn't complete, would probably never be complete, but it was real, and it was mine. My phone buzzed with a text from Nicole. "Thank you for showing us what's possible when someone decides to stop settling and start living. You've changed all of our lives for the better." I smiled, setting the phone aside and looking around. My kitchen, this space that had been the site of so much invisible labor and quiet sacrifice. Tomorrow, I would begin planning the next phase of our family business expansion. Next week, I would start teaching pottery classes at the community center. Next month, I would have pieces in 3 different galleries across the Pacific Northwest. But tonight, I was simply Linda Hayes, a woman who had learned to take up space in her own life, to speak her truth even when it was difficult, to create beauty with her hands and meaning with her choices. I was a woman who had discovered that transformation isn't something that happens to you, but something you choose, again and again, until you become the person you were always meant to be. The kitchen was quiet around me, but it wasn't the silence of loneliness or resignation. It was the peaceful quiet of a life lived authentically, of relationships rebuilt on honest foundations, of a future that stretched ahead full of possibilities I was finally brave enough to explore. I finished my tea and turned off the lights, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.